If you had asked me a year ago if I thought my life would unravel like this, I would have laughed. I was the dependable sister, the loyal friend, the one who stayed behind to clean up after family dinners and sent birthday cards to people who barely remembered mine. I built my life around being everything to everyone, and for a long time, that was enough. But then Daniel entered the picture, and everything changed. It was a quiet evening at my sister Amelia's house. She and Daniel had been married for 2 years, and their home reflected the kind of picture-perfect life that people envied. The polished hardwood floors, the subtle scent of lavender drifting through the air, the neatly arranged bookshelves, all of it felt like a carefully curated stage for a life they had built together. And yet, even then I could sense the cracks. Amelia had always been the charismatic one, the kind of woman who could light up a room without trying. She was beautiful in a classic way. Soft blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a laugh that made everyone lean in. I, on the other hand, was quieter, more reserved. My friends called me thoughtful, but I always knew it was their polite way of saying I faded into the background. It was at one of their dinner parties, surrounded by the warm glow of candlelight and the soft murmur of polite conversation, that I first noticed Daniel in a way I shouldn't have. He was standing at the edge of the room, a glass of wine in his hand, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with a quiet intensity. He wasn't like Amelia, loud, vibrant, the center of attention. He was grounded, steady, with a charm that didn't demand to be noticed but couldn't be ignored. "Rachel," he said, catching my eyes. I tried to slip into the kitchen unnoticed. His voice was smooth, low, the kind of voice that made you want to lean in closer. "You're always working too hard. Come sit down." I laughed nervously, waving him off. "Someone has to keep things running while Amelia entertains." "She's lucky to have you," he said, his gaze lingering a second too long. And just like that, something shifted. I told myself it was nothing. A moment of connection, a shared understanding. But as the months passed, those moments became more frequent. It was the way his eyes sought mine across the room, the way he laughed at my jokes a little too easily, the way his hand lingered on my back when he reached around me to grab a plate. It wasn't intentional, I told myself. Daniel was kind to everyone, but deep down, I knew better. One night, everything changed. Amelia had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day at work. I stayed behind to help Daniel clean up after dinner. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of water running and the occasional clink of dishes. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but I was acutely aware of Daniel standing beside me, his presence filling the small space in a way that made it hard to breathe. "You don't have to stay," he said, drying his hands on a towel. "I can handle this." "I don't mind," I replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. "It's no trouble." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy, charged, as if we both knew something was about to happen, but were too afraid to name it. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. I looked up, and the expression on his face stopped me cold. There was something in his eyes. Something raw, unguarded, that made my heart— I don't know how to say this without it sounding wrong, he began, his voice faltering. "But you've been on my mind, more than you should be." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. "Daniel, don't," I whispered, even as my feet refused to move. "I know," he said quickly, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as if anchoring himself. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel. I should have walked away. I should have said something, anything, to stop what was happening. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as the weight of his words settled over me. "You don't mean that," I said finally, my voice shaking. You're just tired or confused. I'm not, he said firmly, stepping closer. And I think you feel it too. His words hung in the air, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. He was right. I had felt it. The connection, the pull, the way my heart raced every time he looked at me. But admitting it felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. I can't do this, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Rachel, he said again, his voice softer this time. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. I'm not asking for anything. I need you to know. I pulled my hand away, the spell breaking, as reality came crashing down around me. I should go, I said, grabbing my bag and heading for the door. Rachel, wait. He called after me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me. I told myself it didn't matter, that nothing had actually happened, but the truth was undeniable. Something had shifted between us, and there was no going back. The days after that night felt like walking a tightrope. I avoided Amelia's house, answering her calls with clipped enthusiasm and polite excuses. She didn't seem to notice. She was always too busy, too caught up in her whirlwind life. But Daniel, he noticed. I saw him a week later at a family gathering, the kind Amelia insisted on hosting every month. The room was filled with laughter and chatter, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat as I stepped through the door. Daniel's eyes found mine almost instantly, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of us. Rachel, Amelia called, pulling me into a hug before I could process the moment. It feels like I haven't seen you in forever. I forced a smile, my gaze darting back to Daniel. He stood across the room, holding a glass of wine, his expression unreadable, but I could feel the tension between us like a physical weight. Throughout the evening, I felt his presence everywhere. When I laughed at a joke, I caught him watching me from the corner of the room. When I reached for a plate, his hand brushed mine, lingering just long enough to send a jolt through my body. It was as if we were caught in an invisible dance, moving around each other, careful not to get too close, yet unable to stay apart. At one point, I excused myself to the kitchen under the guise of needing more wine. The cool air was a welcome relief from the heat of the room, but it didn't last long. Moments later, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his gaze locking onto mine. We need to talk, he said, his voice low. There's nothing to talk about, I replied quickly, my back against the counter. You know that's not true, he said, stepping closer. You've been avoiding me. I understand why, but I need to know if I crossed a line. His words caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't speak. It doesn't matter, I said finally, my voice trembling. What happened? What almost happened? Can't happen again. I know, he said, his eyes searching mine, but that doesn't change how I feel. Daniel, I began, but he cut me off. Just hear me out, he said, his voice almost pleading. I can't pretend anymore, Rachel. I can't act like I don't think about you every time you're in the room, like I don't feel something every time we're near each other. His confession hung in the air, heavy and raw, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. This isn't fair, I whispered. To me, to Amelia, to any of us. You're right, he said, stepping back, his hands running through his hair. But I can't help it. And I don't think you can either. The sound of Amelia's laughter drifted in from the other room, pulling me back to reality. We can't do this, I said, straightening my shoulders. This ends here. Daniel nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. If that's what you want, he said softly. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. You know where to find me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of his words, the intensity of his gaze, replayed in my mind like a broken record. I wanted to hate him for putting me in this position, for making me feel things I shouldn't. But the truth was, I didn't hate him. I hated myself for not being strong enough to walk away. The next day, I found myself at the park, a place I often went to clear my head. I was sitting on a bench, staring at the pond, when I heard his voice. Funny running into you here. I looked up to see Daniel standing a few feet away, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked nervous, almost unsure, and it made my heart ache. I didn't mean to interrupt, he said, taking a cautious step forward. You didn't, I replied, though my voice was barely audible. He sat down beside me, leaving a careful distance between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence was both comforting and suffocating. I don't want to make your life harder, he said finally, his voice breaking the stillness. I don't know how to stop feeling this way. I turned to look at him, and the vulnerability in his eyes took my breath away. Daniel, this can't go anywhere, I said softly. You know that, right? I know, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. But that doesn't mean I don't wish it could. The words hung between us, unspoken but understood. As we sat there, the sun dipping lower in the sky, I realized that no matter how much I tried to fight it, the connection between us was real. And it wasn't going away. I told myself I could handle it, that I could keep my distance and pretend everything was fine. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself, because every time he looked at me, every time he said my name, a part of me wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could rewrite the rules, and that was the most dangerous thought of all. The following days felt like a blur, a strange mix of normalcy and quiet chaos. I threw myself into work, family, anything that would keep me distracted. But no matter how hard I tried, Daniel's words played on repeat in my mind. I can't pretend anymore. The memory of his voice, the raw honesty in his eyes, haunted me. I avoided Amelia's calls, inventing excuses for why I couldn't meet for lunch or stop by the house. She didn't question it. She was too busy planning her next big event or juggling work deadlines. But Daniel wasn't so easily deterred. It started with the texts. Simple, innocent messages at first. Hope you're doing okay. Thinking of you. I told myself to ignore them, to draw a line, but each one chipped away at my resolve. Then came the calls. His voice was like a magnet, pulling me in no matter how much I tried to resist. The breaking point came one evening when my phone buzzed with a text. Can we talk? Please. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I knew what I should do. Delete it, block his number, and move on. But instead, my fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing 2 words that sealed my fate. Come over. When Daniel arrived, the tension in the air was suffocating. He stood in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. I wasn't sure you'd actually let me come, he said softly. Neither was I admitted, stepping aside to let him in. The house was quiet, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the walls. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. I don't know what I'm doing here, I said finally, my voice trembling. This is wrong. I know, he replied, taking a cautious step closer. But I can't stay away. His words sent a shiver down my spine, and before I could stop myself, I asked, why me? Why me? Out of everyone, why did it have to be me? Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because you see me, Rachel. Not the version I'd try to be for Amelia, or for anyone else. You make me feel alive. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I turned away, my arms wrapped around myself. This will destroy everything, I whispered. I know, he said, his voice breaking. But doesn't it feel like it's already destroyed us not to say it? Not to admit what's been there all along? Before I could respond, I felt his hand on my shoulder, warm and steady. He turned me to face him, his eyes searching mine for permission. For anything that would tell him this wasn't a mistake. Rachel, he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Tell me to leave, and I will. But if you don't, I didn't let him finish. Instead, I closed the space between us, my lips finding his in a kiss that was tentative at first but quickly deepened. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, the world around us disappearing. We moved to the couch, the weight of the moment pressing down on us as his touch grew bolder. He reached for my hand, guiding it to his chest, and I felt the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath my palm. This isn't just physical for me, he murmured, his breath warm against my neck. This is everything. His words sent a jolt through me, and I pulled back, my hands trembling. Daniel, we can't do this, but we already are, he said, his gaze steady. And you can't tell me it doesn't feel right. Time seemed to blur after that. Every touch, every whispered word felt like crossing another line, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. His hands moved over me with a care that made my heart ache, as if he were memorizing every detail, every curve. At one point, he reached for a bowl of peaches on the coffee table, holding one out to me with a small smile. Something sweet? He asked, his tone teasing but tender. I nodded, taking the peach from his hand, and as I bit into it, the juice dripped down my chin. Daniel leaned in, his lips brushing against my skin to catch it. The intimacy of the gesture made my breath hitch, and I felt a warmth spread through me that I couldn't ignore. By the time the night ended, the boundaries we'd tried so hard to maintain were shattered. Daniel sat beside me on the couch, his arm draped over my shoulders, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. I don't know what happens next, I admitted, my voice barely audible. Neither do I, he said, pressing a soft kiss to my temple. But I know I don't want this to end. As he left that night, the weight of what we'd done began to settle over me. I told myself it was a mistake, that it would end here. But deep down, I knew better. This was only the beginning, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't deny one simple truth. I didn't want it to end. The morning after, I told myself it had to stop. The weight of what Daniel and I had done sat heavy in my chest. A mixture of guilt, fear, and something I was too scared to name. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a moment of weakness born out of loneliness and longing. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice I couldn't undo. I avoided Amelia for days, dodging her calls and skipping our usual weekly coffee date. She didn't press, too consumed by her endless projects and responsibilities. But Daniel, he didn't let me go so easily. The first time I saw him after that night was at the grocery store. I hadn't planned to see him. It was one of those chance encounters that felt like fate's cruel joke. I turned the corner of the produce aisle, and there he was, standing by the oranges. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world around us seemed to blur. Rachel, he said, his voice soft but steady. We need to talk. There's nothing to talk about, I replied quickly. glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "You know that's not true," he said, stepping closer. "Please, just 5 minutes." I hesitated, my heart pounding. "Fine." Outside. In the parking lot, the cold air bit at my skin, but I barely noticed. Daniel stood across from me, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression a mix of determination and something softer, something I couldn't bring myself to name. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About us." "There is no us," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "What happened? It can't happen again." "But it will," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "You feel it too." "I know you do." I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Instead, I looked away, the lump in my throat too thick to speak. After that, the lines between us blurred even further. We began finding excuses to see each other. An errand that conveniently brought him near my house, a late-night text that turned into an hours-long conversation. Each interaction felt like stepping closer to a precipice, knowing full well there was no turning back. One evening, Daniel called. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Amelia's working late," he said. "I was wondering if you wanted to come over." I hesitated, my pulse quickening. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Please, Rachel," he said, his voice almost pleading. "I just want to see you. We don't have to do anything. I just need to be near you." Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing. When I arrived at his house, the air between us was heavy with unspoken tension. He greeted me at the door, his smile soft but strained. "Thank you for coming," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The living room was warm and inviting, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. We sat on the couch, a careful distance between us, but the space felt insignificant under the weight of everything left unsaid. "I can't keep doing this," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Neither can I," he replied, "but I don't know how to stop." He reached for my hand then, his fingers brushing against mine, and I felt the familiar jolt of electricity that seemed to exist only between us. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice trembling, "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I can't keep pretending that what I feel for you isn't real." "Daniel," I began. But he cut me off. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. I need you to know that you matter to me, more than I can explain." His words broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned forward, my forehead resting against his. His breath hitched, and I felt his hand move to my cheek, his touch impossibly gentle. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, the fire crackling softly in the background. And then, without thinking, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing against his. The kiss was slow, deliberate, filled with a longing that neither of us could deny. He pulled me closer, his hands moving to my waist, and I felt myself melting into him. It was as if the rest of the world had fallen away, leaving only the two of us and the fragile, impossible thing we'd built together. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of stolen touches and whispered confessions. At one point, Daniel reached for a bowl of strawberries on the coffee table, holding one out to me with a small smile. "Something sweet?" he asked, his tone light but teasing. I nodded, taking the strawberry from his hand, and as I bit into it, the juice dripped down my fingers. He leaned in, his lips brushing against my hand to catch it, and the intimacy of the gesture made my heart ache. When the night ended, I sat in my car for what felt like hours, staring at the steering wheel and trying to make sense of what my life had become. I told myself it couldn't go on, that something had to give, But deep down, I knew the truth. This was my new normal. And no matter how much I tried to fight it, I didn't want it to end. The fragile world we had created, built on secrets and stolen moments, was destined to collapse. Deep down, I think we both knew it, even as we clung to each other, pretending we could hold it all together. But when the end came, it was faster, messier, and more devastating than I could have imagined. It started with Amelia. She had always been busy, always juggling too much. But something shifted in her the past few weeks. She began noticing the details. The way I avoided her invitations, the sudden tension in Daniel's presence, the way his gaze lingered on me when he thought no one was watching. "Rachel," she said one afternoon as we sat on her porch. The sun was bright, but her expression was shadowed with suspicion. "Is there something going on with you and Daniel?" The question hit me like a punch to the stomach. My mind raced for an answer. Something convincing, but all I managed was, "Why would you ask that?" "Because you've been different," she said, her tone sharp. "And so has he." I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "Amelia, that's ridiculous. Daniel is your husband." "Exactly," she snapped. "And I know him. So don't tell me I'm imagining things." The conversation ended there, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few days, Amelia's suspicions grew, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. Daniel and I became more careful, more paranoid, but it wasn't enough. The storm broke one rainy evening when Amelia returned home earlier than expected. I was at their house helping Daniel organize the garage, a flimsy excuse we had both clung to in order to spend time together. We were sitting on the floor, our hands brushing as we sifted through boxes, when the door slammed open. "What the hell is going on here?" Amelia's voice cut through the room like a knife. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Daniel stood, his face pale, his hands raised as if to calm her. "Amelia, it's not what it looks like," he began. But the words sounded hollow, even to me. Her gaze snapped to me, her eyes blazing with betrayal. "How could you?" She spat, her voice shaking. "You're my sister, Rachel. My sister." He tried to speak, to explain, but no words came. The room felt like it was spinning, and all I could focus on was the look of devastation on her face. "You knew," she continued, her voice rising. "You knew how hard things have been for us, and this is what you do." "Amelia, please," Daniel said, stepping closer, but she recoiled as if his touch would burn her. "Don't," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't you dare." The fallout was swift and brutal. Amelia demanded I leave, her words cutting like shards of glass. "You're dead to me," she said as I stumbled out the door, the rain soaking through my clothes. I wanted to tell her I was sorry, that I never meant for this to happen, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Daniel tried to call me that night, but I couldn't answer. I sat in my dark apartment, the sound of the rain outside matching the storm raging inside me. I had destroyed everything: my relationship with my sister, the fragile trust we'd built over the years, the life I thought I could control. And for what? Days turned into weeks, and the silence was deafening. Amelia didn't call, didn't text. The absence of her in my life was a hollow ache I couldn't ignore. Daniel tried to reach out, but I pushed him away, knowing that whatever we had, it wasn't worth the price we'd paid. But then, one night, he showed up at my door. His clothes were soaked from the rain, his expression raw with desperation. "I had to see you," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't lose you, Rachel." "You already have," I said, my voice breaking. "We've lost everything." "But I still have you," he said, stepping closer. "And that has to mean something." I wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave and never come back. But as he stood there, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own, I realized I couldn't. Despite everything, despite the wreckage we'd left in our wake, I couldn't let him go. We spent the night talking, laying bare all the things we'd kept hidden for so long. He told me about his unhappiness, his struggles with Amelia, his fear of being invisible. I told him about my loneliness, my longing to be seen, to be wanted. By the time the sun rose, we were both exhausted, but something had shifted. We weren't just two people caught in a whirlwind of forbidden emotions. We were something more, something broken but real. The road ahead wasn't easy. Amelia cut both of us out of her life, and the guilt of what we'd done hung over us like a shadow. But slowly, we began to rebuild, piece by piece. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was ours. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about Amelia, about the life I'd had before, and the choices that had brought me here. I didn't know if I'd ever find forgiveness, hers or my own. But as Daniel sat beside me, his hand warm in mine, I realized that, for better or worse, I had found something else. And for now, that was enough.